am Ernie Chambers. Once again, I have a few comments that I intend to make. I may not be in front of the camera as long today as I ordinarily am, but sometimes circumstances alter cases. What I intend to discuss primarily is the situation that is evolving in Afghanistan, but there's an ongoing condition on the shores of this country. COVID-19 is still a very serious, super serious problem. Not only older people such as myself, people with compromised immune systems, and they can be of any age, but certain groups of very young children cannot receive any vaccination. One little girl, she looked like she may have been in the first grade, was not going to be able to get a vaccination, but she said that she has a little brother who will be at home when she comes from school. So she thinks everybody should wear a mask. And even if the schools don't say you have to wear one, she intends to, because she does not want to put her little brother in a situation to contract that horrendous disease. People literally are dying. What I think should be a partial theme song for this effort that intelligent people are putting forth is the one that Lionel Richie, others got together, all of these very famous and popular singers from all genre, to sing a song called We Are the World. And it had to do with trying to raise money to combat the famine conditions on the continent of Africa. And I can't sing, and I don't want to defame that song by even trying, but they said, we are the world, we are the children. We have to get together. Let me see, we ought to get together, so let's start giving, or something like that. And they sang that song like I had never heard a presentation before. I could have been affected by the good cause that had led to it. But at any rate, this little girl made me think of a scripture that I had learned many moons ago. And periodically I quote it. That verse says, a little child shall lead them. When these children are put on camera and allowed to speak, they ought to be listened to. They are not politically motivated. They don't belong to any political party. They're just those small, innocent ones who have not yet been corrupted. And they can see with a clarity that older people, and I don't mean necessarily just my age, but teenagers and others, they will not have that clarity of vision because it becomes beclouded by misinformation, things that people they respect will say, even though what those people speak could qualify as lunacy. But when one of these clear-eyed, innocent children will give advice, we should pay heed. A little child should lead them. And when it comes to COVID, I was vaccinated completely in March. That means I got both shots. Moderna was the medication I'd received. They have said, and by they I meant the doctors, the professionals, that Moderna is very effective, and there is no reason to consider this time a booster shot or a third vaccination. But if that is the determination, I will be first in line. And if not first, I'll be near the front of the line. I am not trying to play politics for any party. I don't belong to a political party. I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I'm not some of these offshoots, they call them progressives, all of those. As soon as you allow a label to be attached to you, thinking by other people stops. Every label carries baggage. If you take a label, all of the attitudes that the one you're talking to, which are directed toward that label will attach to you, whether you would justifiably wear those labels or not. So I don't wear any label at all. Oh, people have a lot of labels that hang on me, and it makes them feel better to call me names and wish that I would go to the place where it's very hot. And I don't get angry. People need an outlet for their frustrations, for their anger, even their hatred. And if that hatred can be directed toward me verbally, whether written or orally, does not affect me at all. They're just expressing an opinion. One person's opinion does not sway me. 1,000 people's opinion will not sway me. Sometimes one person has influenced 1,000. So the advice I give to people is that you must get for yourself an internal compass of values that will dictate to you how you should live your life, the things you ought to do, what you believe to be true and required for yourself. But one thing is true no matter where: you cannot use a crooked ruler and draw a straight line. So instead of, as white people say, live according to the ABCs, they mean by that, I guess, follow the rules. I reverse them to CBA. Whether you're Black, Latinx, call yourself white, or any other label, CBA will do it for you. Conceive it, believe it, achieve it. You must start with yourself. And I do intend to talk about Afghanistan, but it won't take me as long as I have in the past on other issues, because there's not a tremendous amount to say that is new. I want to read a couple of articles first, again, about guns. The shooting is still occurring. If I had a heart, which I don't, it would probably be broken when I see, read about, or hear about a young person being shot to death, harmed grievously in any manner. I feel that a loss has been suffered by all of us. We don't know what that young person may have been able to achieve, but even not looking at it selfishly, every person should be in a position to live out his or her life without having it cut short by the stupid, thoughtless, or malicious, vicious act of some coward. Guns give cowards what they call credit, courage. When I was growing up many years ago, if you had a grievance with somebody and you wanted to have a face down, knuckles were what you used. And a fist fight would occur. People would stand around and agitate and pull for whomever they want to win. But after the fist fight, nobody is dead. Nobody is seriously wounded. And if either or both of them knew so little about fist fighting that they landed a blow to the head, then that set of knuckles is not going to be used upside the head again. And this set will not be used upside the head the first time because it learned from what happened to the other one. So despite all of the fist fights we may have had, the skirmishes, the tussles, the wrestling matches, we didn't have deaths that resulted. Now, with the ready access to guns, with so much in the world that inspires, even legitimatizes hatred, young people absorb it. They imitate what they see. There's no need to think. And it is not a characteristic of those who are young to think deeply about anything, because there are so many things they're trying to grapple with for the first time. There are anxieties, and you see a commercial, will I be liked? Will I be judged? Will I be too judgy? Will I be ignored? Will I kiss a boy? Will I kiss a girl? And things that will make older people just shake their head and tisk, tisk, tisk. If they could think back to when they wore a younger person's clothes, they would see that these young people are trying to find their way. And we should do all we can not to stand in their way, but to help them find their way. So on the guns, I'm going to limit myself to these two articles. The first one is dated December 11th, 2007. And it was from the Omaha World Herald. Chambers wants gun crackdown. The lawmaker says violence won't be curbed until weapons are. This was from the Omaha World Herald. State Senator Ernie Chambers of Omaha said Wednesday that his community's problems with violence won't be resolved until authorities begin tracking down and weeding out those who are supplying guns to young people and brothers, sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals. These are things I said on the floor of the legislature, as I always was willing to say what was on my mind, what I thought was appropriate, in the open, so people could see that I'm the one saying it. Quote, where are our kids getting these guns, unquote, Chambers asked. Quote, these guns are commonly in the hands of all these young people, but nothing is being done to stop these young people from getting them. End of quote. He said the violence is too easily blamed on a breakdown in parenting among Black Omahans. Quote, if this were happening in the white community, action would be taken to stop these guns from coming in, he said. They didn't blame a breakdown in parenting when methamphetamine was the rage. They didn't say white people must get out and stop it. They didn't say it was a breakdown in the community. They said the legislature's got to do something about it. And the legislature responded. Chambers was responding to Monday's comments by Mayor Mike Fahey, who said Friday's shooting death of a 6-year-old girl would have happened no matter how many police officers were on the street. Quote, a lot of this is tied to parenting, the lack of parenting, the lack of mentoring, Fahey said. When these young white people were having these keg parties with alcohol, the then governor's wife got involved. They put together what they called a multidisciplined task force, state troopers, county sheriffs, city police, all working together to find the sources of these kegs of alcohol that young people were obtaining, young white people, and going out into farm country and other out of the way places and getting drunk as skunks. Nobody said it's a breakdown in parenting. Nobody said there needs to be more mentoring. What they all said, and put the law enforcement community behind it, is to find the source of this alcohol and the ones supplying it and take care of them. And it goes back to what I said this old deacon told the young guy who kept praying for the Lord to get the spiders out of his spider webs out of his life. Don't ask God to take the spider webs out of your life, kill the spider. But as white people always do, different strokes for different folks. A breakdown in parenting, and he never talked about where the guns come from. Chambers said he intended to keep pressuring the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the FBI, as well as local law enforcement agencies to investigate gun dealing in Omaha. Obviously, I got nowhere. There's a guy who was the former agent in charge of the FBI in Omaha who writes a periodic column for the World Herald, and he wrote one trying to justify people, white people, not wanting certain things said about slavery because he said slavery happened on the continent of Africa and other places. That word is applied to a lot of circumstances where it does not apply. If you deprive somebody of their freedom when you're in a combat situation, the ones captured are prisoners of war, those kind of things. When there were wars on the continent, there were not machine guns, cannons, bombs, napalm. There may have been spears and daggers and hand-to-hand combat, but there were not mass killings. And true enough, captives were taken. And some people refer to them as slaves. But here's the irony of that. These captives would be incorporated into the tribe which had captured them, and in some cases, rise to the level of a chief. In the days of Rome, they took slaves. And these people were called slaves, those who've been deprived of their freedom. But they were not treated like livestock. They were not bred like cows, pigs, and chickens to have meat or those things that these animals produce sold for the consumption of human beings. Under this slavery, which truly was slavery in America, Black people were treated like livestock. Not only were they required to breed between themselves and among themselves to produce children, the white masters, so-called, would have sex with these Black women and produce children. And even though these children were the slaveholder's child and children when they were plural, they would be sold on the open market at auction. The kind of slavery they had in America was unknown anywhere else on the planet Earth. When the Hebrews were supposedly enslaved in Egypt, it was not what was done in the country. As Chief Justice, Roman Catholic, Roger B. Taney of the US Supreme Court said, Black men are so far superior to white people that a Black man has no rights which a white man is bound to respect. And that was what they used as their guidepost. Thomas Jefferson is praised for writing the Declaration of Independence. That was not language generated by Thomas Jefferson. Those kind of things were copied. And he said, all men are created equal. That would be a dead giveaway that there can be no such slavery, such a thing as slavery. But he went further and said they are endowed with certain unalienable rights that can't be taken among these life and liberty. He was violating those things while he was writing those words. He even wanted to put in some words referring to slavery as an execrable wrong. But the other white men said, no, we're slaveholders. We hold them. When slaves, when Black people were rounded up in Africa and brought to this hemisphere, and their existence was not acknowledged in the Constitution, never the word slavery was used. But those bound to labor, they didn't want to put the word slavery in it. And they didn't talk about Black people immigrating to this country. Immigrants come voluntarily. They talked to Black people, certain persons who are imported. You import products. No slavery was like that in the United States. No nation dealt with people as the white people dealt with slaves in this country. Somebody might say, well, what about the Holocaust? The Nazis didn't make the Jews slaves. The Nazis made them victims of wholesale slaughter and torture. And it was not for decades and centuries. So we, even today, have to deal with these quasi intellectual white people like this former FBI agent who writes for the World Herald, trying to justify or excuse the wrongful things done in this country. The things that this so-called anti-CRT movement, critical race theory, are trying to do is expunge or erase from American history the things that really happened. Those things are so horrible that people like this FBI agent, this regent who offered a resolution to the Board of Regents to not allow that kind of teaching to be required at the university level, like the 22 legislators who signed a statement supporting it, who would not have dared do it were I in the legislature. That shows the power of my words and my presence. They knew that they would have had a price to pay when we went back into session in January. So when I would give them their almost daily lessons in Black history and American history, it was Black oppression within the confines of American history. They didn't challenge it. They wouldn't say anything. First of all, they didn't know anything. But those who did not want to come to grips with me. I've never been shy or fearful of saying what I have on my mind. And I never will be. And I get distracted when I set out to say one thing and I begin to think about not only what has happened to us, but continues to happen. One of these days, I'm going to cite the article in the Constitution, because people won't read it, which deals with the one item that could not be touched for a certain number of years. The Constitutional Convention was, well, I'm not going to go into all that, but it was in the 1700s, a long time ago before I was born. But for decades, this item could not be touched by an amendment to the Constitution, nor by anything any state might do. It didn't have to do with the right to vote, didn't have to do with the right to marry, didn't have anything to do with the right to go to school, didn't have anything to do with America having a representative form of government, didn't have anything to do with not having titles of nobility. You know, the one thing that could not be touched even by an amendment to the Constitution, the slave trade. The slave trade. And now these racists would like to expunge everything said about that. What about in law school, all of the cases in the textbook that relate to segregation, discrimination, the so-called Black codes in the South, the lynchings, bombings, burnings, none of that could be dealt with because it makes little white children feel bad. But I had to fight like the devil to get little Black Sambo out of the schools, even though it degraded little Black children directly. I have a lot on my mind, a lot that troubles me because I cannot find a solution, and I do not see it on the horizon. White people who have a modicum of intelligence and know better are the biggest enemies to progress. The only thing better than dissenting under pressure is more dissent. And I will always raise my voice against these wrongful things being done. But that first article talked about a breakdown in parenting. That's what white Mayor Fahey said, and they named a street or something after him. Going back to that article, in the first 7 months of this year, which was 2007, authorities seized 471 guns, the largest share, 216, coming from Northeast Omaha. Of those, 121 guns were seized in July alone. See, when they want to get the guns, they can get them. Gun dealers, gun suppliers cannot operate in secret. Those who might want a gun have to know who the gun sellers are. So when the police, for some reason or other, decide they want to go collect some guns, they can do it. But I don't see where it said they arrested 271 people for having illegal guns. Since August, Omaha police have been running roaming checkpoints with extra officers and hotspots for drug and gang activity, the mayor's office said. If the gang activity doesn't involve guns, it's not as significant as the guns. Drugs don't kill with the lethality of guns. There are people now who are still becoming opioid addicted. And the opioids are produced and sold, you can say pushed, by Big Pharma. The Purdue family are being questioned still about the supplying of opioids. But anyway, in 2007, a headline, Chambers Wants Gun Crackdown, and I didn't start asking for that in 2007. They decided to write that story. Then 4 years later, it's the same old song. This article, May 2nd, 2011. Homicide victims' kin pay tribute to mothers. A group of families gathered in the cafeteria of the Omaha Public Schools District Headquarters Sunday for a different kind of Mother's Day event. The afternoon, quote, tribute to mothers, unquote, program drew about 50 people and was billed as a motivational event to recognize families of area homicide victims. Sponsored by Pulse, a local nonprofit organization created to support those affected by the area's violent crimes, the event featured music and a guest appearance by local dignitaries, including former state senator Ernie Chambers. Chambers, the keynote speaker, urged families to treat the rest of the community with respect and work to reduce violent crimes in the metropolitan area. No magic bullet exists to stop shootings and urban crime, Chambers said, but authorities must work harder to address the spread of illicit firearms in the city. If we're not talking about the source of the guns, we're not talking about anything, Chambers said. That was in 2011. 10 years later, 2021, it's the same old song, the same old beat. The guns in the hands of young people are killing young people. There is no legitimate or legal way for a young person to possess a gun. If Omaha cops can trace the gun that killed that female officer, I believe her last name was Orozco, trace it to a pawn shop in Alabama, you know that they can find the sellers and suppliers of these illegal guns in Omaha. But until those guns, those very types of guns, are turned against the police and white people, nobody cares except us about them even being here. Now I'll touch on this situation with Afghanistan. And I'm going to probably have to be signaled when my time is up because I went over time for what I intended to do. This is something that I wrote, and it appeared in the Omaha Star, October 4th, 2001, 20 years ago. And the headline was Bush's War, Folly, Military Futility, Political Opportunism. And some of the blowback is happening right now because America is hightailing it out of Afghanistan. This is what I wrote 10 years ago. I must postpone analysis of the speech President Bush delivered before Congress. Other matters must be addressed, and the speech will always be there. Dissent, dissent, dissent. Dissent is most needed and most opposed during times of national hysteria and madness. I choose to raise my dissenting voice in the midst of the madness rather than wait until it is safe. True believers in democratic government should speak now or forever hold their peace. And I'm reading this so that I won't get off track. Politicians, editorialists, and others insist that everybody must line up and support Bush in his quote, war, unquote. To do that, I would have to switch off my brain, shut down my judgment, and assume the role of a mindless, non-thinking automaton. Such cannot be, for I am a man. Nothing is so painful to listen to as sportscasters, professional athletes, and Bush trying to sound profound and philosophical, discussing the September 11th disaster and its fallout. The next most painful thing is to hear the endless chatter about, quote, heroes, unquote. Everything wearing a cop outfit or firefighter paraphernalia is labeled a, quote, hero, unquote. My mind is filled with the images of the killer cops who gunned down unarmed Black men with impunity. And I think of the discriminatory employment practices of the Omaha Fire Department. And I scoff at the phony yammering about America being, quote, united, unquote. This is after the planes flew into those towers in New York. While athletes are wearing flags and parroting what politicians, pundits, and Bushites have spat out, and the populace is wrapping itself in the flag and caterwauling, God bless America. Corporate vultures are circling and targeting the spoils generated for them by the disaster, meaning the planes flying into those towers in New York. And the nation shall be plunged deep in debt. Ironically, among loud boasts about, quote, American freedoms, unquote, especially freedom of speech, pressure is exerted from practically every quarter to squelch dissent. Only one thing is more helpful to the democratic process than dissent during a time of national hysteria and madness is more dissent. In addition to threats and racial slurs from irate white Americans who are furious because they cannot make me say what they want me to say, I have fielded accusations of, quote, treason based on my comments regarding the lunacy of Bush's bogus political war and the foolishness of Americans for going along with it. Evincing the ignorance typical of so many white Americans at all levels, caught in the throes of irrational emotionalism. They do not know how the Constitution defines treason. That's in Article 3, Section 3. Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt event act or on confession in open court. Since Congress alone is empowered by the Constitution to declare war and has not done so, America is not at war and therefore has no, quote, enemies, unquote. Besides, my words would not be treasonous even during war. Proportionality. Proportionality simply means the punishment fits the offense. Never should the innocent be held accountable for or suffer for the wrongs of the guilty. This principle undergirds my legislation requiring compensation for innocent third parties harmed as a result of police chases. No other state has such a law in the country because no other state has me in the legislature. Destruction of the World Trade Center was a disproportionate response to any provocation of which the U.S. stands guilty because it victimized thousands of civilians who had no guilty hand in the formulation or execution of American governmental policies that include exporting terrorism through its infamous School of the Americas, the destabilization and subversion and overthrow of governments, training, equipping, and supporting torturers and members of right-wing death squads, all of which America did, and setting up murderous, corrupt puppet dictators, which Trump praised, rubbed elbows with, and some are still traveling from this country to get tight, as they say, jam up and jelly tight with them. Many Americans bred and fed on racism are screaming and clamoring for the blood of Arabs and quote, Arab lookalikes. Regrettably, Bush's overheated, and this is Bush, not Trump, but those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. Regrettably, Bush's overheated political rhetoric, despite half-hearted disclaimers, is pandering to and fomenting such racist lunacy. They ache with yearning for a bloody, disproportionate military response against innocent people in Afghanistan, who, according to American leaders, are already being grievously oppressed by the Taliban regime. It is also worth noting how America's top brass suddenly and cynically are outraged at the mistreatment of females by the Taliban in spite of discrimination, sexual harassment, and oppression of women at all levels of life in the USA, including the American military. Along with most of the world, America showed more concern about the destruction of Buddhist statues by the Taliban than about mistreatment of women. Illusion of war, which constitutes political opportunism. On the home front, Bush must maintain and sustain the illusion of quote, war, unquote, to fuel his political agenda of accommodating the wealthy and infringing civil liberties. U.S. Attorney General Ashcroft is doing his part by terrifying the American populace with ominous and dire warnings of, quote, more hijackings and terror attacks, unquote, so that there may be less opposition to his so-called anti-terror legislation, which will expand government surveillance, destroy property through governmental intrusion into people's personal affairs, and following Bush's signals, buck hustlers, commercialization, and exploitation of the disaster are sprouting up everywhere, from used car ads on TV to appeals from capitalists to, quote, invest to help America recover from the terrorist attack, unquote. One outfit is hawking, quote, American heroes, silver dollars, unquote, accompanied by a free lapel pin made from a New York quarter. If I saw what I think I saw, even underwear is getting into the act. Fear quotient. Fear is absolutely essential. Remember, this is dealing with Afghanistan and the buildup toward invading. Fear is absolutely essential to Bush's political agenda because it diverts attention from reality and fastens it on whatever is chosen by the fearmongers. Thus, Bush continues initiating activities to raise the FQ, That's fear quotient. By creating alarm and anxiety, politicians and capitalists are masters at milking public misery and turning it into the rich cream of political and financial gain. By terrorizing fire departments, by making them believe their equipment will be commandeered by terrorists, Bush has succeeded in spreading the fear virus into every village and hamlet, which may have a volunteer fire department. Another cunning masterstroke is the placing of National Guardsmen in and around every airport in the USA, even though they have no training for whatever they're supposed to do, and nobody seems to know just what that is. Their presence definitely adds to fear and anxiety. Include the alarm sounded over crop dusting planes and trucks, and the stench of fear grows palpable. Indeed, there's more than a mere stench. It's like a thick, malignant ooze draining from the pores of a jumpy, terrified nation, kept on edge by its opportunistic political leaders, including the president. Bush is leading up to something, just like Trump wanted to. Bush may take it into his empty skull to bring baby buggies and strollers under government scrutiny as the next category of possible purveyors of terrorist explosives or chemical and biological agents. Bush would argue, quote, "Who would ever suspect buggies and strollers," unquote. And Pogo, the comic strip character, would repeat resignedly, "We has met the enemy and he is us." Jetliners down in flames. And this was done to underscore the kind of language used by cops when they murder Black men doing dangerous things such as living and breathing. Nothing is as dangerous as a simple-minded weak man with strong weapons to play with. What could be more potent in ratcheting up the fear quotient than the prospect of commercial jetliners being shot out of the sky by some trigger-happy cowboy in the sky? Assurances from Hopalong Bush that fighter pilots will use good judgment and not act in haste are not very assuring or reassuring, all things considered. Now here we come. Analogize the cowboys in the air to killer cops, notorious for gunning down unarmed Black men for making a suspicious move, such as breathing while Black. Not much will be needed to lead one of the cowboys to perceive as suspicious a sudden move by an airliner due to unexpected turbulence. With a whoop and a "Remember the Alamo," the cowboy will send the offending airliner plummeting to the earth in flames. Imitating the highly successful tactic of killer cops, and that's what I'm emphasizing by this example. The cowboys will explain, and they like to use technical language. This pilot had target under observation when target unexpected suspicious maneuver, veering off course and dropping below assigned altitude. This pilot had probable cause to believe that action against target was justified. Instinctively, based on training and fearing for the life and safety of persons unknown in locations unknown that might have been attacked by target, this pilot locked onto target and instinctively applied training and discharged projectiles into the fuselage of target, causing several sudden releases of energy, in parentheses, explosions, and ignition of flammables, which resulted in target flying into the ground, accompanied by a huge sudden release of energy and sound waves and significant combustion, otherwise known as a crash. The general heading the Board of Inquiry will inquire about this. Are you saying the airliner crashed? Fighter pilot: that's affirmative, sir. Then why didn't you say so? The general: there were no survivors. Fighter cowboy. That's affirmative, sir. Collateral damage was total. Unquote. Further review will lead to the cowboy being awarded a special medal for, quote, selfless personal courage and dedication to the United States and the welfare of its citizens, unquote. Do I sound bitter? Do I sound upset? If that's an affirmative, you are very perceptive. The non-war. Nothing is so worthless as generals without a war, unless it's a military buildup and deployment in foreign realms without a conventional enemy to fight. High-tech war material is piling up everywhere, but there's nothing to do with it. If bombers, missiles, rockets, and fighter jets were to cut loose in a massive bombardment of Afghanistan, it would expose the fallacy of the notion that what was done in Kosovo can be effective in Afghanistan, flying high above and dropping bombs. Any such bombardment done as a display of the might, resolve, and ferocity of an angry, aroused superpower would leave an embarrassing result when the smoke cleared. Blasted boulders, scattered sand, ravaged rubble, and perhaps a few clogged caves. Futility in action. Once the world witnessed in ineffectualness of the superpower's awesome weaponry, the myth of its military invincibility would suffer a setback. At the same time, the Arab world would be revolted and slapped back to its senses. America cannot afford such a come down. Its leaders already are experiencing sheepishness for having mobilized enough personnel and materiel to launch World War III in a vain attempt to collar one man named Osama bin Laden. Its image would suffer irreparable damage, and the bullying colossus of the North would take its place alongside other military behemoths, which history demonstrated to be more bluster than effectiveness when the chips were on the table. The French in Russia, the Nazis in Russia, the Nazis, I say, in Russia, the Nazis attacked Russia and the Russians just fell back. And then when that Russian winter set in and the Nazis couldn't scavenge enough to operate, Russians wiped them out. But continuing, the French in Haiti, the only battle that Napoleon ever lost in this hemisphere was in Haiti under Toussaint Louverture, a Black man. That drove the French out of this hemisphere. They were whipped in detail in Haiti by Black men. The British and the Soviets by turns in Afghanistan. The Soviets were in Afghanistan a decade, and they wound up being driven out under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, who was a scion of a wealthy family in Afghanistan, and they were in construction. And while working against the Russians and driving them out, they did a lot of what you might call construction work in the mountains of Afghanistan, carving fortresses and other places that were secure, which America found to be very difficult to deal with once they got into Afghanistan and tried to root out people. Oh, and by the way, Osama bin Laden did not sit in a palace. Osama bin Laden carried a weapon and was in the front of the ones who attacked the Russians. The Americans in Korea and Vietnam. Obviously, the military mind is slow or incapable of grasping and applying the lessons of military history. Hence, such disastrous lessons periodically do reruns with predictably disastrous consequences for the slow of wit. If to save face, America stupidly invades Afghanistan to conduct a ground war, disregarding the combined experiences of Britain and the Soviet Union, it will be virtually alone. Too fresh and raw are the memories of Russia and neighboring former Soviet republics, memories spawned by 10 futile years on the ground in Afghanistan, which cost them 15,000 men and resulted in a shattering defeat 11 years ago in Afghanistan. Disheartening political reality. If Afghanistan should be evaded by American ground forces, the blood and casualties promised by Bush will begin materializing rapidly. Rudyard Kipling penned a warning about the conflict in that part of the world. There is not a rock for 20 miles. There is not a clump of tree, but rested a man. Well, let me skip some of it. I'll just read this instead of giving you the whole poem, which I was inclined to do. There is rock to the left and rock to the right, and low-lean thorn between, and you may hear a breechbolt snick where never a man is seen. In other words, they've got you in their sights. That's from the Ballad of the East and West by Rudyard Kipling. As winter sets in, the unfortunate victims of Bush's policy, young men and women, with African Americans disproportionately taking casualties, as has always happened in such military fiascos orchestrated by short-sighted American white men, they will see a frigid, desolate, mountainous Afghanistan can be as inhospitable and devastating a hell as the sweltering jungles of Vietnam. Paraphrasing the Bible, there will be great weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth by disillusioned family members of the young casualties as they ask bitterly, what's it all about, Alfie? What are they asking now? That America's hightailing it out of there after 20 years? What was it for? What was it all about, Alfie? And you know how America left Saigon? They had those helicopters and people getting out of there any way they could. And they even had visuals on the news. You know how these helicopters have what look like runners under the bottom of them rather than wheels? They had people with their arms wrapped around those runners flying as the helicopters flew, trying to, get out of Dodge after America had been there all that time, using napalm to destroy vegetation, poison chemicals, the My Lai massacre, and other things that showed the barbarity of the United States and the war crimes that it is capable of committing. But the victor never is charged formally with war crimes. Had America lost the war, Tojo and Adolf would have been the judges and the final word in war crime trials against Americans. The victor never stands in the dock. What will Bush and his political cronies be doing? They will be snug, warm, and lounging in comfort and safety as they continue throwing their lavish dinners and glittering social functions, while young Americans languish and perish as lonely invaders in a strange and desolate land, Afghanistan. Bush's, quote, people, unquote, you could substitute Trump's, the moneyed vultures fat, gouging the government, unquote, even bogus political ones. But on the other hand, if saner individuals manage to restrain Bush, as Colin Powell is laboriously and assiduously trying to do, what will become of the awesome military buildup and deployment? They will be available for a rainy political day when the polls fall. In the same way that former President Clinton ordered a military strike against an African target, a Sudan pharmaceutical plant, when he was in political trouble, which was his impeachment, he ordered that strike against the pharmaceutical plant in the Sudan. Bush likewise can order a strike in some wasteland in Afghanistan and declare victory in his quote war. Evidence, put up or shut up. I do not believe America has solid evidence against Osama bin Laden in the September 11th disaster. I'm reminded of the first trial in Virginia in 1807, presided over by Supreme Court Chief Justice John Marshall. The prosecution was unable to present two witnesses to the same overt act required by the Constitution, and Burr was acquitted by the jury. The prosecution complained that the secret nature of the act alleged against Burr made it scarcely ever possible to obtain two witnesses. The Chief Justice wrote what should be said to the Bushites, quote, "The difficulty of proving a fact will not justify conviction without proof," unquote. Produce the facts or fold. And they never had the facts directly against Osama bin Laden. Oh, and how they chortled and chirped the American choir led by former President Obama when they ambushed Osama bin Laden in a house where he was with his wives, unarmed, and shot him down. And I don't know to this day where they disposed of his remains. Some of them said they took him out to sea because they didn't want a shrine to be built if anybody knew that Osama had been buried and where he had been buried. Other nations, along with the Taliban, are demanding what America demands before turning criminally accused U.S. servicemen over to the authorities in the country where the crimes occurred. Hard evidence. That's what America demands. The rest of the world wants that from America, which they don't get. One-way street. In his speech before Congress, Bush called on the whole world to rally to the side of America in this, quote, war that he was going to launch against Afghanistan because of the September 11th bombing. He was arguing that it is a matter involving all nations of the world, but it only happened in America. Yet, number one, America refuses to pay its United Nations dues. Two, America opposes and is trying to derail establishment of the International Criminal Court, which would try only the most heinous breaches of international law when a suspect's own government refused or was unable to bring charges. Three, in July, by walking out, America sabotaged a 56-nation effort to devise a protocol for enforcement of a global ban on germ warfare pursuant to the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention signed by America and 142 other nations. In September, it was discovered that America itself is doing germ weapons research and experimentation, which may be in violation of that treaty. And remember how they considered the murderer, as they call him, in Syria for using chemical weapons against the populace? Number four, America's walkout at the World Conference on Racism in South Africa needs no comment. There was a conference on the worst type of racism at that time going on in South Africa. And America walked out of that conference. And now these people want to expunge that because they would call that critical race theory, where you're criticizing America for walking out of a commission that was reviewing the apartheid in South Africa. Fortunately, there was a young Black man in the Nebraska legislature who persuaded the legislature to pass a resolution divesting millions of Nebraska public dollars from companies doing business in or with South Africa. When that resolution was enacted, the Rand Daily Mail, which is the most influential newspaper in South Africa, ran an editorial and said what a danger that was to South Africa, because it was a Midwestern state, conservative, that had done it. And they neglected to mention that that state was persuaded by the lone Black member of that legislature. And it did start a bandwagon effect rolling. and other states duplicated and followed Nebraska's lead, and ultimately the United States did it, and down toppled apartheid in South Africa. And the one talking to you now is the one who started that bandwagon rolling. But you know what they say, a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. I'm not a prophet. Wouldn't let anybody call me that. But I catch more flack in Omaha than I do anywhere else. Haughty. Oh, then this one. America's efforts to dismantle the Treaty on Global Warming further illustrates its international obstructionism and uncooperativeness. Yet with all of this, Bush, in his speech before Congress, called on the whole world to rally to the side of America in his war, arguing that it is a matter involving all the nations of the world. But when it came to those things that had the world's involvement and did involve them, America turned its back, walked out, or did everything it could to undermine it, because America practices racism, discrimination, and that is the warp and woof of American society and American laws. Haughty, arrogant America, while breaking wind in the face of the rest of the world, now calls upon the rest of the world to do America's self-serving bidding. Ain't that a fine kettle of fish? Well, you can't talk like I talk without being attacked. And sure enough, that article of mine, which was published in Omaha Star in October of 2001, was met with an editorial December 31st of 2001. And the headline, Senator Stumbles as Seer, S-E-E-R. Ernie Chambers' predictions about Afghanistan fell far short of accuracy. And as I read this, think of what's happening now, 20 years later, and whether or not I foresaw what the World Herald didn't foresee, what Bush may have foreseen but didn't care about, with America hightailing it out of Afghanistan after having made promises to the people there that America would stand with them. They would help them fight against the Taliban. And there were people in Afghanistan, contrary to what your president, what's his name? It'll come to me in a minute. Biden, I know his name is Biden. I was just biding my time. There were interpreters, Afghanistan citizens, who were working with the United States as interpreters, and they wore uniforms of the United States. They carried weapons provided by the United States. They were on the front lines fighting against the Taliban like American soldiers, and now they're being deserted, and Biden is saying that they wouldn't defend their own country. Well, they weren't able to do that in the first place, and they didn't start the war. They could say, like Billy Joel's song, we didn't start the fire. Oh, it's always burning since the world's been turning. We didn't start the fire. Who started the war in Afghanistan? Bush, the United States. And at first they were using bombs, missiles from far away because they didn't want to get on the ground. Then they got on the ground, they got bogged down like Russia had done and stayed there all that time. And now they're being run out like Russia was being run out. And I'm gonna read briefly from what I responded to the World Herald. Oh, but I gotta read what they said first. State Senator Ernie Chambers has had various opportunities over the years to say, I told you so. And he has not hesitated to trumpet it whenever he was proved correct. Last April, he tweaked fellow members of the legislature by noting that his warning from 1997 had proved right. The courts wound up declaring the vague wording of the state's ban on partial birth abortion to be unconstitutional. I even tried to help them amend it to correct it, but they refused. And the Supreme Court referred to my debate to show that the legislature deliberately didn't want to do the right thing, so they struck it down, as I said they would. Chambers' analysis has fallen short at times when it comes to military matters, however. Now think about what's happening right now, 20 years later. The Omaha lawmaker in October predicted that U.S. forces in Afghanistan would find themselves bogged down in a quagmire, the same as other, quote, military behemoths from history. Americans would meet disaster in Afghanistan, he said, the same as the French in Russia, the Nazis in Russia, the French in Haiti, the British and Soviets by turns in Afghanistan. Is that what's happening? Is America facing what those nations faced? Are they being forced to run out? Then the World Herald quotes some of the things that I wrote, which I won't reread here because I just read them. He wrote, Chambers, as winter sets in, the unfortunate victims of Bush's folly, young men and women, with African Americans disproportionately taking casualties, as has always happened in such military fiascos orchestrated by short-sighted American white men, will see that a frigid, desolate, mountainous Afghanistan can be as inhospitable and devastating a hell as the sweltering jungles of Vietnam. Paraphrasing the Bible, there will be great weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth by disillusioned family members of the young casualties as they ask bitterly, what's it all about, Alfie? What are they saying today? The families of these young men and women who spent all that time fighting in Afghanistan are now asking, why were they there? What did they lose when they lost their lives? And for what did they lose it? I talked about it in 2011, said those would be the questions asked when America gets run out. And now America's not running out, they're flying out. They had to clear 1,000 people from the airport runways in order to fly out those American diplomats. So what I talked about happening ultimately with America in Afghanistan is happening. It's not that I'm a fortune teller. It's not that I can read the future. It's that I can read history and I understand what I read, and I know America better than Americans know themselves. And I predicted what would happen, the catastrophe that results from failure to apply the lessons from the past. Then here's what they quoted me saying. Chambers wrote on October 4th, referring to US military, quote, obviously the military mind is slow or incapable of grasping and applying the lessons of military history. Hence, such disastrous lessons periodically do reruns with predictably disastrous consequences for the slow of wit. And that's what's happening right now. But here's what the World Herald concludes. Chambers' claim stands the truth precisely on its head. In Afghanistan, the US military did glean lessons from the past conflicts. As a result, it adopted a strategy that was both creative and effective. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, were smugly backward-looking. They, like Chambers, predicted that the Taliban-American fight would follow the same basic path as the Taliban-Soviet conflict. They could hardly have been more mistaken. What was the path of the Soviet-Taliban conflict? The Soviet Union was driven out after 10 years. It took America 20 years to learn the lesson, and now they're hightailing it out, getting out of Dodge. And that, brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, is what a Black person who is conscious and educated and unafraid will deal with and has dealt with, in my case, for decades. Those are the kind of things that white people, believe it or not, brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, not every white person who is blue-eyed is the devil. Not every white person is an active racist, although I say all white people have racism in them. They could not avoid it because it is taken in with their mother's milk. It's preached about in church. It's taught in the schools. It's in the politics. It's everywhere. And they take these racist notions in, and the racist notions become the currency of the day, and they say these things and practice these things. And when they're called to task on it, they say, gee, I didn't even know. I didn't realize you'd be offended by being called the N-word. That's what they always say. They didn't know. So I will give them this much. I do say every white person in America is imbued with racism, but I'll give them this much. Not every white person is an active racist in the sense of committing acts of racism, but given the right circumstances and the opportunity, they would. I got a chuckle, a bitter one, when they showed on television these members of the Taliban in the president's office, in the headquarters of the government, sitting at the desk, looking at the pictures on the wall, laughing and chatting with each other. And Americans were talking about what a terrible thing to have happened. But old, critical me have a mind that went back to January 6th of this year at the Capitol in the United States of America, where these white racists committing insurrection had their feet on the desks of senators, walking through the hall saying, Nancy, Nancy, calling out the Speaker of the House. A cordon of men surrounding Vice President Pence, and he was running as fast as his little legs would carry him to get out of the Capitol building in the United States of America. This is what I'm thinking when these newscasters are lamenting the presence of the Taliban in these government offices in Afghanistan. I'm still envisioning how laughable it was, although it wasn't humorous, laughable. Mitt Romney on a surveillance camera was shown walking down a hall, and somebody told him what was going on, and he broke into a sprint, which if he had done on a track during the Olympics would have gotten him a gold medal in the 100-meter dash. Then all of these people, these Republicans in the House, from that guy with the crooked teeth on down, were hiding and scurrying for cover. And guess what happened? When a group of the marauders had broken into the building, had broken their way, there was a black man who almost materialized. And he went and toward them and then started backing away. And he lured those fools away from a door which was not too many yards down the hall, which would have given them some of their congressional quarry. Instead, he made them veer and backed away. And then they began to pursue him. And he went up some stairs. And by taking that self-sacrificing action, this man who is being called the N-word, other black Capitol Police being called the N-word and worse, rescuing these white people who are now talking about expunging the embarrassing but true history of what America is about. And that's the thanks that Black people always have gotten. But some people don't realize, I wish she hadn't done it. I can't fault her though, because Black people have that strange compassion. She saved George Washington from ingesting poison. If she'd have held her peace and let the Lord fight that battle, George Washington would not have been around. He owned hundreds of slaves. I said hundreds of slaves. I'm sure he had sex with those women, produced babies. It's hard to find a white person in America with the last name Washington. And I guess so many Black people are named Washington because so many were produced by him on his plantation among those hundreds of slaves, many of whom were women who could not resist his brutal, animalistic advances. And then the offspring were often sold at auction, like so many piglets, and chickens. Do I sound bitter? As I stated earlier, if from you that's an affirmative, you are very perceptive. And let me tell you something else that most white people don't know, or Black people, because they don't read history. But there came a period in the 1800s when some white people who were slaveholders didn't want to be interfered with by the people in the North called the Union. So they said, we're going to get out of this Union. We're going to secede. They were called secessionists. You know what those dirty, nasty, Southern secessionist, slaveholding devils did, who were trying to destroy the Union, destroy America? You know what they did? Just because George Washington owned hundreds of Black slaves, like they were owning slaves and wanted to protect their, quote, right, unquote, to hold slaves, they claimed George Washington as one of their own. He was one of their own, and they gained some traction from the prestige George Washington had. But what a lot of white people don't know, and the few who know are not telling, George Washington's slave holding was dividing the American public, not bringing the people together. When they were talking about waging a war of liberation against England, because there were white people who were saying, how can we fight against Britain for our freedom when we have slaveholding and are defending slaveholding and protecting slaveholding? And there was a division in the North because there were Northerners who supported the slaveholding. I'm going to ask for a signal because I got carried away. How much time do I have left roughly? Do I have about 5 minutes at least? You see how humble I can become? Here's what I want to do. I want to tell you one thing where Daniel Webster, he was a big-headed guy, and he had contempt for Black people. And he used to go for walks, and he saw this old Black man. Oh, it's always an old Black man. And his name was Mose. It's always Mose. He was sitting down on the riverbank fishing. And Daniel Webster said, Mose, what are you doing? They always ask us the obvious. And Mose, knowing the role he has to play, said, well, Mr. Not call him by his last name. Well, Mr. Webster, I'm fishing. Have you caught anything today yet, Mose? No, sir, Mr. Webster, the fish don't seem to be biting today. He said, Mose, do you ever have a thought in your head other than fishing? And at this point, Mose can't take it anymore. He is a man. He knows he's a man, but his manhood finally asserted itself. And he said, Mr. Webster, not only do I have a thought or two, but I will make a bet with you. And Daniel Webster said that it can talk, it can say things other than yes or no, sir. Well, Mose, what have you got on your mind? Mr. Webster, I like that houndstooth hat you're wearing. I will bet you my own fishing rod against your hat that you're on the other side of this river. And Daniel Webster laughed inside. It was just a flash in the pan. He hasn't got a thought in his head. Daniel Webster said, now you're sure you want this bet, Mose? And Mose said, yes, Mr. Webster. He gave him the Mr., but not yes, sir. So Mr. Webster said, all right, Mose, I'm gonna put my hat here on this rock and you lay your fishing pole next to it, which Mose did. And then Mr. Webster said, now Mose, prove to me that I'm on the other side of this river. Mose said, well, Mr. Webster, before we go, is that one side of the river? And Daniel Webster said, certainly is. He said, then is this the other side of the river? And Daniel Webster said, certainly it is. He said, Mr. Webster, I just proved to you that you're on the other side of the river. And he picked up the hat, picked up his rod. Daniel Webster immediately summoned the Ku Klux Klan. They caught Mose and strung him up until he was dead and burned his body after filling it full of lead. Brothers and sisters, friends, enemies, and neutrals, my name is Ernie Chambers, and I am through for this time around. So like the canary said, when the door to his cage was left open, I'm out of here.